1997, 39 people died in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. They were found dressed identically: black shirts, black pants, Nike sneakers, purple shrouds laid carefully across their faces. Here's what the coverage almost never leads with. These were educated people: software developers, web designers, artists, people with degrees, with careers, with families who loved them. One of them had a PhD. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because the assumption, the one most of us make almost automatically, is that cults prey on the desperate, the isolated, the intellectually fragile, people with nowhere else to go. The data tells a different story. And understanding why that assumption is wrong is the only way to actually understand how cult psychology works. Let's start with what we think we know. The word cult triggers a very specific image: robes, a compound, a follower who had no other options and no one left to turn to. That image is comforting. I want you to notice that it's comforting because it means it could never be you. And that comfort is exactly what makes the image so dangerous. Here's the first thing you need to understand about cult recruitment. It is not random. It is targeted. And the targets are not primarily the vulnerable. Stephen Hassan, former NXIVM counselor, architect of the BITE model, has documented this extensively. Robert Cialdini's research on commitment and consistency, Janja Lalit's work on bounded choice. The academic literature converges on the same finding. High-control groups systematically seek out the intelligent, the idealistic, and the socially connected. Why? Because intelligent, idealistic people make better recruiters. They have wider networks. They're more persuasive. And this is the mechanism I want to spend most of this video on. They carry a specific psychological vulnerability that less analytical thinkers don't share in the same way. Here's the thing about intelligence: it is not neutral. It is a tool, and like any tool, it can work for you or it can be turned against you. The question is, who's holding it? The psychological mechanism is called motivated reasoning, and it is not a flaw, it is a feature of how human cognition works. When we encounter information that conflicts with something we want to believe, something we've already invested in, something that gives us meaning or identity, our brains don't weigh that information neutrally. They recruit our analytical capacity to defend the existing belief. Read through that slowly and notice something. A higher analytical capacity means a greater ability to construct sophisticated justifications for beliefs we were already emotionally committed to. There's a phrase researchers use: smarter people are better at rationalizing. It's not an insult, it's a neurological observation. The same cognitive horsepower that allows someone to solve complex problems can be captured, redirected toward protecting a belief system from scrutiny. And here's the thing about sophisticated high-control groups. They don't walk up to a PhD and say, "Abandon your critical faculties and follow me." That would never work. What they do is give that PhD a worldview, a framework, an intellectual architecture with its own internal logic, its own terminology, its own hierarchy of insight. NXIVM didn't call itself a cult. It called itself an executive success program. It had curriculum, modules, a ranking system. It attracted engineers, lawyers, doctors, and working actors who genuinely wanted to grow. The intelligence wasn't bypassed. It was recruited. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because the question isn't, how does someone smart enough to know better end up inside something like this? The question is, what does knowing better actually protect you from, and what doesn't it protect you from at all? There are 3 specific mechanisms that high-control groups use against analytical thinkers, not around their intelligence, against it. The first is identity investment. By the time a recruit has moved through initial training, they've done something that feels meaningful. They've learned a new vocabulary. They've completed early milestones. They've had what felt like genuine insight about themselves and who they could become. The group has become part of how they understand their own identity. Psychologists call this identity fusion. In practice, it means that criticizing the group is no longer an intellectual exercise, it's an existential threat. Leaving isn't a decision, it's a dismantling of the self. The second mechanism is social proof cascading. Intelligent people trust evidence, and other intelligent people in the group are evidence. If the person next to you has a law degree, and the person across from you built a company, and the person leading this session holds a PhD in behavioral science, your brain registers. These are sharp people who examined this and concluded it was real. That's not a bypass of your critical thinking. That's your critical thinking operating exactly as designed and landing on a faulty conclusion because the social evidence was engineered to mislead it. The third, and the most sophisticated, is what the BITE model identifies as thought stopping. Critical thinking is specifically targeted. Thought stopping exists because of critical thinking. The loaded language exists because of critical thinking. The gradual social isolation exists because the group understands that one honest conversation with someone outside, someone who loves you and isn't afraid to tell you what they see, is the single greatest threat to everything they've constructed. They're not afraid of your doubt. They planned for it. And here's the thing about thought stopping for highly analytical people. It doesn't look like thought stopping. It looks like redirecting, reframing, reaching for a concept from the group's framework that explains the discomfort without requiring you to examine the source of the discomfort. The genius, and I use that word deliberately, is that you do it to yourself. The cage is made of your own reasoning. That's what makes it so difficult to see. If this kind of analysis is what you're looking for, subscribe. There's more like this. Let me get specific about how this actually unfolds. The recruitment phase doesn't begin with doctrine. It begins with resonance. High control groups are precise at identifying what their targets actually want. And intelligent, ambitious people tend to want the same things: meaning, community, the feeling of being exceptional, of being selected for something most people aren't capable of understanding. The initial offering is never join us. It's, you're different from most people. We can see that. And we'd like to show you something. And then one night, and this is consistent across documented recruitment narratives, the recruit realizes they've arrived somewhere they didn't intend to go. Not through a dramatic moment, through a quiet recognition that the center of their social world has shifted, that the people they call first when something happens are all in the group, that the language they use to understand themselves is the group's language. By the time someone is deep inside, the architecture isn't external anymore, it's internal. The beliefs are their beliefs, the framework is their framework. The identity the group cultivated over months or years is now the identity they're protecting. They didn't trap you in a room, they rebuilt the room inside your head. And when the walls are internal, when the cage is made of meaning and belonging and the terror of being no one, walking out isn't a decision, it's a dismantling. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If intelligence doesn't protect you, if it can be actively exploited, what does? The research converges on two factors. The first is epistemic humility. Not doubt for its own sake, but a genuine practiced willingness to ask, am I reasoning toward this conclusion or from evidence? The capacity to notice when your analytical mind is being deployed in service of something you want to be true. Intelligent people are often least practiced at this, because they're often right. And being often right trains the brain to trust its own conclusions, in a way that becomes eventually a structural vulnerability. The second is relational diversity. The single most consistent predictor of recovery from cult involvement in the research literature is the presence of a relationship outside the group. Someone who knew you before. Someone who doesn't speak the language, doesn't accept the framework, and loves you enough to say, I don't recognize you in this. Not because that relationship immediately breaks the indoctrination. It rarely does. But because it keeps a door open. A door that might not get walked through for years. But that stays cracked. The group knows this. That's why isolation, slow, deliberate, social isolation, is one of the first priorities. They don't remove your outside relationships all at once. They make them slowly less nourishing, less like the real you, less essential, more like a version of yourself from before you understood what you understand now. That's the point. I want you to sit with something before you close this. The 39 people who died in that mansion in 1997 weren't weak. They were searching. And they found something that gave that search a shape, a community, a purpose, an intellectual framework sophisticated enough to survive their own scrutiny. Intelligence is not armor. Analytical ability is not armor. What those 39 people needed wasn't more information. They needed one person outside who could see them clearly and wasn't afraid to say so. So here's the question I want to leave you with. In your own life, who is that person for you? And more importantly, are you being that person for someone else? Subscribe if you want to stay in it.